In his foreword, Whitney wrote that the book was a painstakingly documented, academically excellent work of socio-biological political history. Finally, in true 15th-century polygenic fashion, Whitney regurgitated the view that different races did not belong to the same species. Michael Levin, born 1943, is the fifth member of the new bigot brigade. He is a professor of philosophy at the City University of New York. He seems to me to be just an old-fashioned, isolated, prejudiced person who fears African Americans. His personal experiences have colored his intolerant and narrow worldview. In an interview in Rolling Stone in 1994, Levin stated that he had been mugged so many times. Always by blacks, he doesn't say. Blacks just have fewer inhibitions, a greater readiness to express anger, and impulsiveness. What do they do that for? Because the alternative, to work and save, is not psychologically available. He believes blackness is a sign of danger, and that given the rate of crime among African Americans, whites should fear and avoid blacks. Like his Pioneer Fund colleagues, Levin believes that intelligence is a unitary hereditary factor, that blacks are less intelligent than whites, and that this should drive policy recommendations on affirmative action, school segregation, housing policy, welfare reform, and criminal justice. He advocates such things as store owners refusing blacks entry into their stores, police searches of blacks in circumstances that are prohibited for whites, treatment of black underage offenders as adults, and making blacks ride in separate subway cars patrolled by police. He also believes that the standards in universities have been reduced by the presence of intellectually inferior black students. However, Levin's main focus is on black criminality, which he claims is related to the genetic incapacity of blacks to abide by white norms, and he proposes that even free will is correlated with race. Such traits as honesty, self-restraint, and cooperativeness did not have the same evolutionary value in Africa as they did in Eurasia. Blacks just aren't as moral as whites genetically, Levin argues. He holds that blacks have two unalterable characteristics: less intelligence and greater proneness to violence. Thus, segregation is needed in housing, employment, and schools. Ultimately, Levin would have us eliminate affirmative action, welfare, and the civil rights laws. Levin does no research in these areas, and his views, like those of the Pioneer Fund members who support him, are based solely on accepted truths and pure prejudice, not on scientific facts. It is amazing to me that such people as Gordon and Levin could be so prejudiced, intolerant, and hateful. Both are of Jewish descent. Levin's grandparents fled Russia during the Tsar's pogroms against Jews, and members of his family were killed in the Holocaust. Gordon and Levin obviously do not understand how Jews fit into the history of polygenics, eugenics, Nazism, scientific racism, and the Pioneer Fund, and how their new friends would treat them if they ever obtained political power. Being a descendant of Russian Jews myself, I cannot understand how anyone whose ancestors have been subjected to the horrors of prejudice could themselves be stricken by such ignorance and hateful intolerance. I consider these two neo-eugenicist Pioneer Fund recipients to be intolerant, hateful individuals who have missed the train of modern science. The remaining two Pioneer Fund major grant awardees are J. Philippe Rushton and Richard Lynn. In fact, these are the all-stars of the new Bigot Brigade team. Rushton, 1943 through 2012, was a professor of psychology at Western Ontario University. He was a long-time recipient of grants from the Pioneer Fund. Just as Jensen had done, in 1989 Rushton created his own nonprofit corporation, the Charles Darwin Research Institute, so that he could receive pioneer funds. In 2002, when Harry Weyer died, Rushton was appointed president of the Pioneer Fund, a position he held until his death in October 2012. Rushton based all of his racist ideology on three major premises: that a genetically determined, simple IQ is real, that there are truly biologically based races, in fact 3, among humans, and that certain races have higher IQs than others. However, Rushton is not a geneticist. As the world-renowned geneticist David Suzuki explains, to geneticists, classification based on skin color gives us groupings that are biologically meaningless. Besides, so long as society imposes such totally different social conditions and pressures on the basis of skin color, the cause basis for differences in IQ scores of blacks and whites can never be answered scientifically. What does Rushton use as the scientific basis for his claim that 3 biological races exist? He relies on what he imagines a team of extraterrestrial scientists would identify if they were called upon to immediately subdivide the human population, presumably a classification based purely on skin color. Another justification for his racial classification is common usage. However, we now know that there is more genetic variation within than between races. For example, the genetic distance between Pygmies and Ethiopians is greater than that between Ethiopians and Southern Europeans. Geneticists, biologists, and anthropologists now agree that biological races do not exist in the human population. As Graves states, in reality, Rushton is a spider spinning a pseudoscientific web of incorrectly stated hypotheses supported with dubious evidence. His ideas have not graduated beyond those of the anthropologists of the early 20th century. Rushton's view of IQ is just as antiquated as his view of human races. Most modern scientists' view of IQ is similar to that reached by Otto Kleinberg, who in the late 1920s concluded that environment alone, and not heredity or selective migration, accounted for the differences in IQ. Kleinberg urged his fellow psychologists to use the concept of culture. In 1944, Kleinberg edited and contributed to a volume on the intellectual ability of African Americans. He concluded that the notion of ranking races on the basis of their mental or psychological characteristics lacked any scientific evidence, and that competent researchers in the field generally agreed with that conclusion. More recently, Jefferson Fish has tried to convince his psychologist colleagues of much the same thing in his provocative article, Why Psychologists Should Learn Some Anthropology. In response to the Jensenism of the 1960s and 1970s, Brace, Gamble, and Bond wrote that one gets the feeling that anthropology has been caught napping to a certain extent because it may have felt that the basic issues were resolved a generation and more ago. The insights of Tyler and Boas from before the turn of the century and their application to combat the racism of the Immigration Restriction League, the Eugenics movement, and the grisly rise of Hitler's Aryan theories have now retreated so far into the past that they have become practically a dead issue. The anthropological view of culture has become so patently self-evident to anthropologists that one feels a little foolish at being put into the position of having to repeat it before an intelligent audience. In 1974, psychologist Leon Kamen made a detailed examination of the empirical evidence on IQ test scores. He concluded, there exists no data which would lead a prudent man to accept the hypothesis that IQ test scores are in any degree heritable. More recently, in his preface to an edited volume summarizing current research on race and intelligence, Fish summarizes the conclusions of the authors. Access to schools, school quality, modes of instruction, attitudes toward formal education, and educational values vary cross-culturally. Biological-sounding concepts, especially inheritability, have been misused to imply a genetic basis for group differences in IQ scores. A wide variety of data imply that group differences in IQ are social in origin and can change as the result of changing social circumstances or social interventions. However, Rushton ignores such scientific evidence and builds his imaginative theories on his false premises of biological races and biologically based IQ. One of his theories is based on a misuse and misunderstanding of an outdated model based on life history that seeks to explain radically different reproductive and life history strategies among animal species, the R and K selection model. Rushton summarizes this model in this way. Oysters, producing 500 million eggs a year, exemplify R strategy, while the great apes, producing one infant every 5 years, exemplify the K strategy. In 1950, geneticist T. Dobzhansky proposed that certain aspects of habitat, lifestyle, and life history might be correlated and might be caused by differences in the evolutionary history of certain species. Biologists Robert MacArthur and E. O. Wilson developed this theory further. They predicted that R-selected species would develop in unstable environments and would maximize reproduction by producing a massive number of offspring with little parental care. Their strategy was to flood the environment and hope that some survived. In contrast, K-selected species would be found in stable environments and produce fewer offspring and expend their energy in caring for them, enabling a much higher percentage of infants to survive. Biologist E. R. Pianka proposed a list of traits that presumably could be associated with the extreme poles of the R to K continuum. However, upon further investigation, these predictions were shown to be wrong. Since the 1970s, biologists who study life history theory have proven the R and K selection theory to be false. Many biologists have shown that the premises of the theory do not hold, and the general theory is now considered virtually useless, even for studying vastly different species. In fact, 50% of the between-species tests of the relationship between the characters proposed in